The buzz of the city enveloped Thomas as he maneuvered through the bustling streets of New York in September 1929. There was a certain energy in the air, a palpable sense of hope and promise that seemed to radiate from the very buildings lining Wall Street. The sidewalks were teeming with people, their faces alight with ambition, their conversations filled with dreams of wealth and success. It was an age defined by optimism, where fortunes were made overnight, and the very notion of a financial downturn felt like a distant echo. In this environment, Thomas, a telegraph operator, was acutely aware of the unyielding tide of speculation washing over the city. Each tick of his machine was a heartbeat of the market, translating the pulse of financial transactions into a cacophony of data. He often found himself reflecting on the shoeshine boy indicator, a colloquial term that suggested the market's health could be gauged by the conversations of the most ordinary citizens. If a shoeshine boy was investing in stocks, it was said, then the market was undoubtedly in a bubble. As he observed young boys polishing shoes for well-dressed men, he noted how they eagerly shared tips on hot stocks, their voices brimming with excitement. This was no mere coincidence. It was a symptom of a larger phenomenon. The streets were alive with speculation, and the fervor was contagious. The concept of leveraging, a financial practice that allowed individuals to buy more stock than they could afford outright, had become the norm. Thomas often overheard snippets of conversation that illustrated this point. "I'm borrowing against my salary," one trader boasted, while another mentioned how easily credit was being extended. It was a game of high stakes, where the lines between risk and reward blurred with each passing day. The allure of easy money overshadowed caution, and the financial world spun faster and faster, drawing in not only seasoned investors, but also those who had never before set foot on the trading floor. Yet as Thomas tapped away at his telegraph, he felt a gnawing sense of disquiet lurking beneath the surface of this prosperity. The atmosphere, though vibrant, was also charged with an undercurrent of anxiety. He had witnessed countless traders rush into the market, their greed eclipsing reason. The vast majority were convinced that the upward trajectory of stock prices would never end. But Thomas, in his quieter moments, pondered the sustainability of such growth. He had seen markets rise and fall, and while the current climate was intoxicating, he wondered how many would be left standing when the music stopped. The telegraph's incessant ticking marked not just the rhythm of financial transactions, but also the heartbeat of a nation caught in the throes of an economic illusion. Every message received and sent seemed to reinforce the idea that the good times would last indefinitely. However, as the days turned into weeks and the stock prices soared to unprecedented heights, the seeds of disillusionment were silently sown. The streets may have glittered with optimism, but beneath that sheen lay a precarious balance, one that was destined to tip. As he tapped away, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the atmosphere was thick with a sense of inevitability. In conversations overheard in the bustling exchange and at nearby cafes, the topic of leverage had become a focal point. "Everyone's doing it," he heard a young broker say, enthusiasm lacing his voice. "You can control thousands of dollars with just a fraction of your own cash." It was a seductive proposition, one that had captured the imagination of countless investors, both seasoned and novice. "Leverage is the name of the game," another trader chimed in, leaning back in his chair as if the weight of the financial world rested solely on his shoulders. "You borrow money to invest, and when the stocks rise, you pocket the profits. It's a win-win." Thomas felt a pang of unease as he listened. The allure of quick gains was intoxicating, but he knew too well the dark side that lurked beneath such tactics. During his breaks, he often found himself in discussions with fellow operators, where the risks of leverage were dissected with a mix of fascination and disbelief. "You know," Thomas interjected one day, "for every dollar you borrow, you're betting against the market. If it turns, you're not just losing your own money, you're in the hole to the bank." A few heads nodded, but the thrill of speculation seemed to overshadow the caution he tried to impart. Another operator, A young man with bright eyes and dreams of grandeur dismissed Thomas's concerns. "But what if it keeps going up? I can't miss out on these returns." His voice rose above the din of the telegraph machine, filled with the reckless optimism that had become so pervasive. Thomas couldn't help but think about the stories he had heard from older traders, tales of men who had once stood where this young man was now, confident, brimming with hope, only to be crushed by the weight of their own ambitions. As the days passed, the consequences of this widespread borrowing began to ripple through the city. Thomas noticed more and more faces filled with anxiety, even amid the bustling optimism. He recalled a conversation with a bank clerk who mentioned how credit lines were being stretched to their limits. "Everyone's over-leveraged," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If the market takes a hit, there's going to be chaos." The notion of margin calls began to circulate among the operators. The very idea sent chills down Thomas's spine. A margin call would force investors to either deposit more cash or sell off their shares at a loss to cover their borrowed amounts. He could already envision the panic that would ensue if the market turned. The potential for a swift descent into despair loomed, and yet the majority seemed blissfully ignorant, caught in the euphoria of the rising tide. Every tick of the telegraph felt heavier, as if the machine itself sensed the precarious balance of the market. Traders were buying stocks at an alarming rate, intoxicated by their perceived invulnerability. Yet, with each transaction, Thomas was acutely aware of the fragility of their confidence. He felt like a solitary observer in a grand play, watching as the actors were blissfully unaware of the impending catastrophe that loomed on the horizon. The conversations that filled the air were filled with bravado, with dreams of wealth that seemed so close. Yet beneath that bravado, there was an undercurrent of desperation, a collective unwillingness to acknowledge the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface. As Thomas continued to work, the tension in the air thickened, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the margin trap was slowly closing in around them all. The growing tension in the air was palpable. A tightrope stretched thin as the telegraph machine began to tick with an urgency that sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. He could feel the weight of the impending chaos, each frantic tap echoing the dread that hung heavily over the exchange. The optimism that had propelled the market to dizzying heights was now giving way to a frantic energy, an unsettling realization creeping into the minds of traders and investors alike. It started slowly, a trickle of bad news that grew into a torrent. Rumors swirled about overvalued stocks and whispers of trouble in the banks. Investors who had once felt invincible began to question their decisions, and the air was charged with an electric sense of foreboding. As the telegraph clattered away, its messages filled with dire warnings and sell orders, Thomas felt like a messenger in a storm. He watched as the numbers on the ticker began to dance erratically, a reflection of the turmoil that was about to unfold. When the market opened that fateful Thursday, the initial wave of panic swept through the exchange like wildfire. Traders, gripped by fear, scrambled to sell their shares, creating a backlog that clogged the telegraph machine. The sheer volume of sell orders was unprecedented, each tick of the machine a reminder of the fraying nerves that had overtaken the floor. Thomas struggled to keep up, his fingers racing across the keys, sending out messages that would soon become the harbingers of despair. In the midst of this chaos, the bankers convened in an emergency meeting, a desperate attempt to stabilize the crumbling confidence in the market. Their discussions were laced with urgency, as they sought to reassure both investors and the public that the financial system was sound. They proposed measures to inject liquidity into the market, hoping to stem the tide of panic that threatened to engulf them all. The prospect of coordinated action brought a flicker of hope, but Thomas remained skeptical. He had seen too much to believe that a few assurances could quell the deep-seated fears that had taken root. As the day wore on, the telegraph continued to echo the frantic activity of the exchange. Thomas witnessed firsthand the faces of traders contorted in disbelief as prices began to plunge. The urgency in their voices rose, a cacophony of anxiety that filled the air. Each sell order seemed to trigger another wave of fear, feeding a cycle that spiraled out of control. The market was a living entity, and it was thrashing against the bonds of reason. By the time evening fell, the bankers' meeting had provided only temporary relief. The measures they discussed, though well-intentioned, were insufficient to counter the tide of fear that had swept through the markets. The illusion of prosperity was cracking, and Thomas could sense the despair that was beginning to seep into the very fabric of the city. The once bustling streets felt eerily quiet as investors returned home, the weight of uncertainty hanging over them like a shroud. In the days that followed, the events of Black Thursday would become etched into the annals of history, a harbinger of the calamity that lay ahead. Thomas, a silent witness to this unfolding tragedy, understood that the panic had just begun. The initial wave of fear had only scratched the surface, and as the city braced itself for the fallout, he could only wonder how deep the wounds would go. The telegraph continued to tick, but now it was a dirge for the dreams that would soon be dashed, a reminder of the fragility of human ambition in the face of unrelenting reality. The city, once buzzing with an intoxicating optimism, now seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a fragile state of uncertainty. As Thomas moved through the streets, the echoes of Black Thursday reverberated in the air, shaping the atmosphere like a dense fog. The throngs of people who just days prior had walked with their heads held high now wore expressions of concern and disbelief. Conversations that had once revolved around investments and fortunes shifted to hushed tones of worry, as if discussing the weather in a storm. The weekend gap felt like an eternity. With the stock exchange shuttered, the psychological shift was palpable. Greed had been the prevailing wind, propelling everyone forward, but now fear seeped into the cracks of their bravado. Thomas observed how individuals who had been so certain of their financial futures now exchanged glances filled with doubt. The bustling cafes and restaurants, which had thrived on the back of prosperity, felt eerily subdued, as if the very walls absorbed the anxious energy of the patrons. Rumors fluttered through the city like leaves in the wind. Speculation about the financial stability of banks, the value of stocks, and the futures of countless individuals filled the air, creating a cacophony of concern. There was a growing realization that the confidence once taken for granted had been a mere illusion. Thomas could see it in the way people clutched their hats and coats a little tighter, avoiding eye contact as they passed one another. The weight of what had transpired was heavy, a collective dread that gnawed at the edges of their minds. As the weekend unfolded, the city became a breeding ground for anxiety. The newspapers blared headlines that fanned the flames of fear, depicting images of panicked traders and the stark realities of financial ruin. Families huddled around their radios, listening intently to the updates, searching for any glimmer of hope that might pierce through the darkness. Thomas found himself drawn to the telegraph office. Even on his days off, the machine's absence felt like a wound. It was a lifeline to the unfolding narrative, and the silence was deafening. On Sunday evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the city held a tense vigil. Thomas could feel the weight of impending doom pressing down on him, a suffocating presence that seemed to settle in the very marrow of the streets. The flickering lights of the city cast long shadows, where once laughter and lively chatter had thrived. Now only whispers of dread remained. The air was thick with anticipation, a prelude to what Monday would bring. The tension was a living entity, feeding on the uncertainty that had taken root in the hearts of the citizens. Each individual was a thread in a tapestry of fear, woven tightly together by shared anxiety. Thomas wondered how deep this sense of despair would reach. Would it suffocate the dreams of the ambitious, or would it merely serve as a harsh awakening? The weekend gap had transformed the landscape of the city, a pause that allowed the reality of their situation to sink in fully. As the dawn of Monday approached, the city held its breath, bracing itself for the bell that would signal the opening of the exchange. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach, a premonition of the chaos that awaited. The shift from greed to fear had taken hold, and he knew that the repercussions would extend far beyond the walls of the stock exchange, rippling through the very fabric of society. The reality of a new era was about to crash down upon them, and Thomas could only brace himself for the impact. The tension that had settled over the city now reached a boiling point, and as the clock struck 9 on that fateful Tuesday morning, the air was electric with anticipation. Thomas stood at his telegraph machine, acutely aware of the monumental moment that was about to unfold. The opening bell was not just a signal for trading to commence, it was a herald of chaos. The atmosphere in the office was thick with anxiety, colleagues exchanging glances that spoke volumes. Fear was palpable, and hope had all but evaporated. As the bell rang out, the first wave of sell orders flooded in with a ferocity that Thomas had never witnessed before. His fingers danced over the keys, but the sheer volume of messages overwhelmed the machine, causing it to sputter and jam. The rhythmic tapping of the telegraph was soon replaced by a cacophony of distress. Each message that clattered through the machine felt like a death knell for the dreams of many. Investors who had once basked in the glow of prosperity were now frantically trying to salvage what remained of their fortunes. The ticker tape, which had once served as a lifeline of information, became a cruel joke. Delays in the data were significant, as the system struggled to keep pace with the onslaught of sell orders. Thomas could see the ticker sputtering out numbers that were already obsolete, reflecting a market that was crumbling under its own weight. The disconnect between reality and the information being transmitted only intensified the growing sense of panic. Investors were reacting to news that was already outdated, compounding their fear and uncertainty. In the exchange, the chaos was palpable. Traders shouted over one another, their voices rising in a frenzy that mirrored the collapsing market. Thomas could hear snippets of their conversations, frantic pleas for buyers who had vanished. The reality was sinking in. There were no buyers left, only a relentless tide of sellers desperately trying to offload their stocks before their value plummeted further. The weight of despair settled over the trading floor like a heavy fog, and Thomas understood that this was not just a financial crisis. It was a human tragedy unfolding in real time. As the minutes ticked by, the volume of sell orders only increased, choked by the limitations of the technology designed to handle such transactions. The telegraph machine, once a symbol of progress and connectivity, now felt like an anchor dragging Thomas down into the depths of despair. He could see the faces of his colleagues contorting with frustration and fear, their eyes reflecting the grim reality that was unfolding. Each order that came through was a testament to the panic that had gripped the nation. Outside, the streets of New York echoed with the cries of despair. People rushed to the banks, desperate to withdraw their savings, only to find long lines stretching around the block. The sense of urgency was palpable as families, once secure in their financial futures, now faced the stark possibility of ruin. The telegraph, a silent witness to the unfolding disaster, continued its relentless ticking, transmitting the news of financial collapse that would resonate through history. As noon approached, the ticker tape had become a harbinger of doom, printing numbers that reflected not just losses, but the end of an era. Thomas felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. He knew that this day would be etched in memory, a turning point not just for the stock market, but for society as a whole. The losses would not be confined to Wall Street. They would spill over into homes, businesses, and the very fabric of the nation. In that moment, Thomas grasped the profound implications of what was happening. The illusion of prosperity had shattered, revealing the fragility of a system built on borrowed confidence. As he continued to send and receive messages, he understood that this was more than just a financial collapse. It was a reckoning. The world that had once promised so much was now unraveling, thread by thread, leaving in its wake a landscape of uncertainty and despair. The opening bell had tolled not just for the stock exchange, but for the dreams of countless individuals who had believed in the permanence of prosperity. The realization that there were no buyers left began to settle heavily in Thomas's mind. As the minutes dragged on, the prices of blue-chip companies, once the bedrock of American industry, plummeted vertically. Stocks that had traded at lofty heights just days prior were now stripped of their value, losing 50% in mere moments. The ticker tape, now a relentless stream of despair, painted a grim picture of the unfolding disaster. Investors who had once thought themselves invincible were suddenly faced with the stark reality of their situation. The panic that had gripped the trading floor was now reflected in the faces of those who had been watching from afar. The collective consciousness of the market was unraveling, and Thomas could feel the weight of that shared despair in every frantic message he transmitted. In the midst of this chaos, the mechanisms of the market were laid bare. The leverage that had driven so many to invest recklessly now became their undoing. Margin calls flooded in, forcing those who had borrowed to buy stocks to liquidate their positions at a loss, further exacerbating the downward spiral. The telegraph machine rattled incessantly, each message a signal of desperation as investors rushed to sell, driven by an instinct to preserve whatever they could salvage. The essence of a market built on trust was collapsing, revealing the fragility of confidence that had buoyed it for so long. The implications were profound. As blue-chip stocks fell, the ripple effects were felt throughout the economy. Companies that had been pillars of the American landscape suddenly found their worth questioned. The fear was contagious. As stocks tumbled, businesses began to brace for a future devoid of the capital needed for expansion or even survival. The interconnectedness of the financial system meant that the collapse of a few could lead to the downfall of many. Outside the walls of the exchange, the streets filled with anxious faces, a mirror to the turmoil inside. Families who had invested their savings in the stock market now faced the prospect of financial ruin. The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty as people tried to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. The realization that the wealth they thought was secure could evaporate overnight was a bitter pill to swallow. Thomas's heart sank as he witnessed the human toll of the unfolding disaster. Traders who had once reveled in the excitement of the markets were now reduced to frantic figures, their voices hoarse from shouting, their faces pale with fear. The realization that there were no buyers left echoed in their shouts, a haunting refrain that underscored the chaos. The floor of the exchange was no longer a place of opportunity. It had transformed into a theater of despair. As the day wore on, the market continued its free fall, and Thomas felt the walls closing in. The telegraph machine, once a conduit of progress, now felt like a harbinger of doom. Each message that came through confirmed the death knell of prosperity, signaling the end of an era that had promised so much. The panic was not merely an event in the stock exchange. It was an upheaval that would resonate through the lives of countless individuals, echoing far beyond the confines of Wall Street. In those moments, Thomas understood that this was not just a financial crisis, it was a societal reckoning. The stark realization that they were witnessing the collapse of a system built on fragile foundations became clear. The air was thick with dread as he continued to send and receive messages, knowing that the implications would be felt for years to come. The market had revealed its true nature, and the lesson was harsh. The illusion of wealth could dissolve in an instant, leaving devastation in its wake. The chaos on the trading floor was palpable, an electric current of fear that coursed through every trader present. Thomas could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. The once vibrant exchanges of ambition and optimism had devolved into a cacophony of despair. Screams pierced the din as traders shouted orders that would never be fulfilled, their voices hoarse and frantic. Faces that had once radiated confidence now wore expressions of sheer terror, eyes wide with disbelief at the unfolding catastrophe. Every tick of the telegraph machine brought news of further declines, each message a reminder of the precariousness of their situation. The panic had escalated beyond mere financial loss. It was now a matter of survival for many. As Thomas sat at his station, he overheard snippets of conversation that chilled him to the bone. Rumors swirled like smoke through the crowd, stories of traders leaping from windows, unable to bear the weight of their losses. Each whispered tale added to the atmosphere of dread that enveloped the floor. The implications of such despair were not limited to personal loss. They spread like wildfire, igniting fear in the hearts of those who had once believed in the invincibility of the market. The smell of sweat and anxiety permeated the room, mingling with the metallic scent of panic. As the ticker tape continued to churn out grim news, Thomas felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. This was not just a financial crisis, it was a societal collapse in the making. Traders once filled with bravado now clung to one another, seeking solace in shared misery. The camaraderie of competition had evaporated, replaced by a desperate need for reassurance. Yet there was none to be found. The reality was stark. The stocks they had once believed would rise indefinitely were now nothing more than symbols of their folly. The mechanisms of leverage that had fueled their ambition now acted as chains, binding them to their inevitable doom. The floor of the exchange, once a theater of opportunity, had transformed into a grim reminder of the fragility of human ambition. Thomas witnessed the toll it took on those around him. Men and women who had dedicated their lives to the market, now stripped of their dignity, their hopes shattered. The realization that dreams could dissolve in an instant was a bitter lesson that many were ill-prepared to face. Outside the exchange, the streets echoed with the fallout. Families were left reeling as the news spread like wildfire, leading to a palpable sense of dread that permeated every corner of the city. The repercussions of the crash extended beyond the walls of Wall Street, infiltrating homes, businesses, and communities. Thomas's heart ached as he considered the lives intertwined with the fortunes lost on that floor. As the day dragged on, the volume of sell orders showed no sign of abating. The desperate cries of traders became a haunting symphony, a reminder that the fragility of the system had finally been laid bare. Each frantic message sent by Thomas was a testament to the unraveling of lives, dreams, and futures. The floor was no longer a place of triumph. It had morphed into a stage for tragedy, where the stakes were measured not just in dollars, but in human lives. In that moment, Thomas understood that the toll of this crash would be felt long after the market stabilized. The echoes of despair would linger in the hearts of those who had witnessed the collapse, serving as a constant reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and blind faith in the system. The fear that gripped the trading floor was merely a precursor to the wider repercussions that would soon engulf the nation, as the illusion of prosperity crumbled before their eyes. The echoes of that catastrophic week had settled into a relentless silence, one that enveloped the city like a heavy fog. Thomas sat at his telegraph station, surrounded by the faint hum of machinery, yet the usual flurry of messages felt like a distant memory. It was now the autumn of 1930, a year since the market had collapsed, and the vibrant pulse of Wall Street had given way to a disheartening stillness. The Roaring Twenties, once a testament to ambition and prosperity, now lay in ruins, a stark reminder of how quickly fortune could evaporate. He often found himself staring out the window, watching the world pass by with a sense of disbelief. The streets, once filled with laughter and dreams, were now lined with breadlines, where men and women stood with hollow eyes, clutching tattered hats and worn-out coats. Thomas remembered the faces of those who had once thrived in the bustling marketplace, now reduced to shadows of their former selves, their hopes dashed against the harsh realities of the Great Depression. The causes of this devastation were multifaceted, rooted in a combination of unchecked speculation, over-leverage, and the very human tendency to believe in the permanence of prosperity. The frenzy of stock trading had left many in financial ruin, and the domino effect had triggered widespread bank failures. Trust, once a cornerstone of the economic system, had been eroded, leaving fear as the prevailing sentiment. Thomas had witnessed firsthand how the rapid collapse of banks had not only destroyed fortunes, but had also shattered the faith people held in institutions designed to protect them. As he observed the lines outside soup kitchens, he reflected on the implications of this crisis. Families, once vibrant and filled with aspiration, now struggled to secure basic necessities. The social fabric was fraying. The optimism that had defined the previous decade was replaced with a pervasive sense of hopelessness. The sound of laughter had been drowned out by the rustling of empty pockets and the soft murmurs of despair. A mother he had seen just a year ago, proudly walking her children to school, now stood in line with a small child, both waiting for a meager meal to sustain them for another day. The mechanisms of survival had shifted drastically. The barter system began to re-emerge as people sought alternatives to cash, which had become a scarce commodity. Neighbors who once barely acknowledged each other now formed communities bound by shared hardship. Thomas often heard conversations that revealed a shift in priorities. People were more concerned about helping one another than the ambitions that had driven them just a year prior. It was a stark transformation, one that highlighted the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. In the heart of the city, the once bustling shops and theaters stood shuttered, their lights extinguished, echoing a loss that was felt by all. The glamorous parties that had defined the social scene had been replaced by small gatherings where the only toast was to survival. Thomas had attended such a gathering recently, where a group of former stockbrokers reminisced about better times, their voices tinged with sorrow. They shared stories of past successes, but the laughter was hollow, overshadowed by the stark reality of their present. As Thomas returned to his work, he felt a profound sense of disillusionment. The telegraph, once a tool of connection and news, now transmitted messages that reflected a nation in turmoil. He sent out updates on bank closures, unemployment rates, and the growing number of people seeking aid. Each message felt like a weight added to his shoulders, a reminder that he was not just a witness to history, but a participant in a narrative that was still unfolding. The death of the Roaring Twenties was not just a financial collapse, it was a cultural shift that would redefine America. The lessons learned from this dark chapter would be etched into the consciousness of a generation. Thomas understood that the path forward would be fraught with challenges, but within the bleakness lay a glimmer of hope. It was the recognition that resilience could emerge from despair, that communities could rebuild from the ashes of their dreams. Yet, as he gazed out at the city, he knew that the scars of this period would linger long after the last breadline had disappeared, serving as a testament to the fragility of prosperity and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The scars of the Great Depression serve as a haunting reminder of the cyclical nature of economic fortune, where the exuberance of one era can swiftly devolve into the despair of another. Thomas, now a year into this new reality, could see the parallels between the 1929 crash and the more subtle bubbles that continued to inflate in the years that followed. History had a way of rhyming, and the lessons learned seemed to fade as quickly as they were written. The root causes of the 1929 crash were not confined to that singular moment in time. They were deeply embedded in a culture that celebrated risk-taking without regard for consequence. Speculation had become a way of life, a gamble that many believed could not fail. The allure of easy money blinded people to the dangers lurking beneath the surface. As Thomas observed the economic landscape, he realized that the same patterns emerged repeatedly, whether it was the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s or the housing market collapse of 2008. In each case, the seeds of greed were sown in fertile ground, nurtured by a collective belief that prosperity was a permanent state. The consequences of these bubbles were profound and often devastating. The fallout from the 1929 crash had not only ruined individual fortunes, but had also led to a complete re-evaluation of financial practices and regulations. The establishment of the Securities and Exchange Commission was a direct response to the excesses of the previous decade, aiming to restore faith in the markets. Yet Thomas recognized that even with such measures in place, the undercurrents of fear and greed remained omnipresent. Each economic recovery seemed to breed a new cycle of speculation, as if society had a collective amnesia regarding the past. Maneuvering through the aftermath of the crash, it was clear that the mechanisms of the market had not fundamentally changed. The very structure that allowed for rapid expansion also facilitated swift collapse. Financial instruments became increasingly complex, often obscuring the risks involved. Investors returned to the market with renewed fervor, emboldened by a sense of invulnerability. Yet, the specter of 1929 lingered, a cautionary tale that seemed to fall on deaf ears. Thomas could see the familiar signs, people drawn into the web of debt, believing that wealth was a mere transaction away. The implications of these cycles extended beyond mere financial loss. They shaped societal attitudes and beliefs about wealth, stability, and the future. The fear that followed a crash did not merely reflect economic uncertainty. it seeped into the very fabric of daily life. Thomas noted how conversations shifted from dreams of success to worries about survival. The optimism that once fueled ambition now became a cautious tread as individuals grappled with the harsh realities of their circumstances. In every economic downturn, there emerged a dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots, a division that deepened societal rifts. The wealth gap widened, leaving many struggling to keep their heads above water while a few thrived. This division was not lost on Thomas, who recognized that the human cost of these cycles was often overlooked in the pursuit of financial gain. The stories of those who lost everything were eclipsed by the narratives of those who capitalized on the chaos, further entrenching a system that favored the few over the many. As he continued to send out messages, Thomas understood that the cycle would repeat itself unless a fundamental shift occurred in how society viewed wealth and risk. The enduring lesson remained clear. Greed and fear were powerful motivators that could easily distort judgment and lead to catastrophic outcomes. The key to breaking the cycle lay in fostering a culture of accountability and awareness, one that valued sustainable growth over reckless speculation. In the quiet moments between messages, Thomas pondered the future. He hoped for a day when the lessons of the past would resonate more deeply, when individuals would approach the markets with caution and wisdom rather than blind ambition. The scars of 1929 would always serve as a reminder, a testament to the fragility of prosperity and the resilience of those who had endured its collapse. Each generation would face its own trials, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could learn to navigate the turbulent waters of finance with a clearer understanding of the dangers that lay ahead.